Good evening. Welcome to this 11th meeting to comment on the 11th lecture on the Gospel of John. Let's begin right away. In the future sixth cultural epoch, the Russo-Slavic epoch, also called the Age of Aquarius, the experience of the spiritual self will evolve and be experienced by individuals in communities. The Templars who cultivated the Church of John were already working in the forces of this future epoch in the 13th century. When we reach this experience of the Aquarian communities, truth will no longer be subjective as it is today. It will no longer be an experience of the periphery, of the 12 points of view, but it will be an experience of the 13th at the center, and it will be just like mathematical truth today. This experiencing of truth will coincide with the experience of community. The very community, through its own forces, will form at its center the Holy Grail, capable of receiving the experience of truth that is the Christ. The spiritual self that is the Holy Grail in man, capable of receiving the life spirit, which is the Christ in man. The highest individuality brought to maturity, the I, will coincide with the highest universality of the experience of community. It will experience itself as community. Spiritual brotherhood and a deep agreement in spirit among human beings will then be realized. A part of humanity will refuse to welcome the Christ and will rely completely on machines. Then, in the future seventh cultural epoch, the American epoch, the life spirit will evolve, and this will pour completely into the grail formed by the communities of spirit, those of the previous Aquarian epoch, which will then be the nuclei of the new humanity of those whom in the book of Revelation are called the elect of the apocalypse. Humans will be completely permeated by the Christ principle, the life spirit, and will live in the harmony of the spiritual Son. They will recognize it as the spirit of this one people, which will be formed by currents from all peoples, all those who have chosen Christ, and the Christ will become the spirit of this new people of the elect of the apocalypse. This will take place on the American continent, and in particular in the western part in California. The part of humanity that has entrusted itself to machines, on the other hand, will clash with those who have chosen the Christ in a war of all against all, which, as mentioned on other occasions, will have to do with the domination of the meteorological sphere, the climate, the atmosphere, and we will return to this topic in this conference, which will be governed by moral or immoral thoughts. The war of all against all, this cataclysm of catastrophe of the air, will end our post-Atlantean era in the events described in the Apocalypse. To summarize, we can say that in the evolution of Atlantis, we have the formation of the physical body as an instrument of the I. In the post-Atlantean evolution still ongoing in the present, there is the gradual penetration of the I into the bodies to form the three souls, acquiring consciousness of the I in the soul, sentient, rational, affective, and consciousness soul. In future evolution, from the sixth cultural epoch onwards, we will arrive at the birth of the spiritual self, of the life spirit in the seventh, and further on, after the war of all against all, of the spirit of man. And here you see this summary image taken from the previous lecture that exemplifies what I'm saying, which connects the 11th lecture with the 10th. So let us delve deep into the sixth cultural epoch, because we can say that the Gospel of John is also the Gospel that allows the I to fully grasp itself in the consciousness soul and to experience forces that emanate from the future and belong to the spiritual self. We could also call it the Gospel that allows us to evolve from the I and the consciousness soul to the spiritual self. In the sixth cultural epoch, humanity will experience the beginning, we might say, of the union, which we could also call marriage or wedding between the human I and the spiritual self. Thus, the human I will be in continuous union with the higher I through the spiritual self. You must imagine that the I that we experience today as earthly gradually unites with the higher solar I. This process, by which we will no longer perceive ourselves only in the earthly I, as many I separated from one another residing in physical bodies, but instead we will feel united in a community of spirits in the higher I, will cause the astral body to be transformed from the I into the spiritual self. So it is the same process seen from 2 points of view: the union of the higher solar I with the earthly I, the pouring of the solar forces of the higher solar I into the earthly I, the penetration of the I into the astral body with its metamorphosis into the spiritual self. Cosmic I of the human being, our astral body, will also have already become a spiritual self, and therefore we will be in the sixth cultural epoch. The spiritual self, life spirit, and spirit man will proceed in their evolution respectively in the future Jupiter, future Venus, future Vulcan. This process of union between the human I and the spiritual self, or rather the transformed astral body, in the occult terminology of Christian esotericism and Rosicrucianism, is called mystical marriage. In the mystical marriage, therefore, peace and brotherhood will not be abstract external ideals, but real experiences of spiritual communities. There will be a deep understanding in the spirit, and people will perceive the same universal wisdom as everyone today recognizes mathematical truth. In order to evolve the spiritual self in a healthy way, because obviously the spiritual self could also evolve in a Luciferic sense, keep in mind that we are always talking about a healthy, regular evolution. Help is needed from above, which is the Christ. Human beings cannot reach the regular spiritual self on their own unless they unite with Christ. Not me, but Christ in me, which expressed in another way means in union with the higher self, because the higher self is in turn the image of the Christ in the heart of man, or if you like, of the sun that illuminates man. Those who believe they can do it on their own instead attract Luciferic spirits, which lead them to evolve a Luciferic spiritual self. So, Luciferic beings actually have a spiritual self, but this spiritual self has evolved by rejecting contact with the Christ. So, they have the ability to create communities, but these communities do not have Christ-like qualities. On the contrary, they have qualities that reject the Christ. Therefore, they reject this, we might say, regular evolutionary dimension for which already the Templars worked and which we yearn for. The help that humanity receives spiritually from Christ unfolds in 3 stages, which we can also see here in the image and which Steiner calls the 3 days of the history of Christianity. In the first stage, the first day, there is the spiritual announcement and the event of the Christ. We have already talked about this in previous meetings. In the Egypto-Chaldean culture and also in the Jewish culture, that is, the culture of the sentient soul, Moses receives the revelation of the invisible God, Eye Asher Eye, that is, I am, I am. This is in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. It is the first preparation, we might say, the announcement of God to the I, the announcement of the God of the I am to the earthly I of the human being. In the fourth Greco-Roman epoch of the rational affective soul, It is the cosmic I, the Christ, who truly descends into the flesh with Christ Jesus, and then the announcement of the I am of Moses' burning bush becomes a historical event because the cosmic I, the Solo Logos, becomes man. The Christ becomes man in Jesus. In the second stage or day of Christianity, which also means of the evolution of the relationship with the I, both the further descent into matter and the progressive degeneration of original Christianity take place, because Christianity takes on forms that are not so much its own, not those of the Christianity of the Gospels, but those of what had been cultivated in a decadent way in the Roman Empire among those who were the Caesars of Rome. So there will be a series of councils that will gradually define the identity of what we call the Catholic Church of Rome, and that proceed, generally speaking, to increasingly eliminate the spirit from Christianity, and therefore the knowledge and understanding of the spirit. What do they mainly target? The cosmic Christ, the cosmic dimension of the Christ being, and therefore the understanding of his mission, which is not just that of a man, however morally evolved we may say he is, but has to do with the cosmic evolution of Earth and humanity as a whole. It has meaning for the entire cosmos. In particular, we can say that the fatal blow was dealt at the Council of Constantinople in 869 AD, in the 9th century AD, where the spirit was eliminated from the occult human constitution. So from that moment on, man is no longer body, soul, and spirit, but only body and soul, with the soul having spiritual qualities. With the Council of Constantinople in the 9th century, therefore, the body-soul dualism that dominates all Western and scientific culture is generated. For example, we find it reformulated as the debate between nature and nurture. But this is nothing more than a disguise, a reproposal of the body-soul dualism, because of the elimination of the spirit and therefore of the knowledge, the understanding of it, a lid is put, so to speak, on the understanding that Christ is a cosmic being who became incarnate. In the current epoch, the fifth epoch of the consciousness soul, humanity descends ever deeper into matter and develops a technical, scientific, industrial, and consumeristic civilization. Christianity itself is progressively materialized and increasingly misunderstood. For example, the Eucharist is understood as the physical transformation of the host into flesh, and external dogmatism develops. Transubstantiation, as we have already said, has nothing to do with the host becoming a piece of flesh. We will see this, and John also says it, blessed are those who believe without having seen. The same applies, for example, to a certain idolatry reserved for relics, who are important and have their own power, but clearly must not become the center of proof of faith. So, gradually, as everything spiritual in Christianity is understood in a more external sense, dogmatism develops, because obviously forms must be fixed and the words that express them must also be fixed. For example, there is dispute over certain terminology within the church which, when not respected, smacks of heresy over time. This is the transition from the fourth cultural epoch to the fifth cultural epoch. Dogmatism begins to prevail. And there will be the Holy Inquisition, which, as you know, basically progressively eradicated all the conceptions of Christianity alternative to that advocated by the Roman Catholic Church itself. This deformation of Christianity is parallel to the general spiritual decline that is, in other words, to man's difficulty in rising to the Spirit. However, this process was necessary for man to learn to take an interest in and to know about matter, whereas already in the first and second cultural epochs, if you remember, there was a prejudice against matter, especially in the first cultural epoch, ancient India. But even in ancient Persia, matter was totally evil because it was the creation of the god of darkness, Ahriman. And so this knowledge of matter, this interest in matter and also in the body, develops individual consciousness. We then come to the third stage, the third day of the history of Christianity, as you can see here. So they coincide with the sentient soul, third period of civilization, the rational soul, fourth period of civilization, and the consciousness soul, fifth period of civilization. Then we will arrive at a spiritual understanding of Christianity and its true realization in human civilization. It is the age of Aquarius, the next cultural epoch. Today, Steiner says we are at the end of the second stage, so we are in a process that goes from the end of the second stage to heralding the third. Humanity must now rediscover true spiritual Christianity and no longer the distorted version that has been advocated until now by the external churches. The method of this awakening. In the course of the evolution of Western esotericism, there have been many forms of esoteric Christianity, all of which sprang from the initiatory experience of the Gospel of John mainly. The method of this more scientific awakening, we can say, is anthroposophical spiritual science. There are also other spiritual sciences that have succeeded one another in the history of Western esotericism. The last of these forms, which also incorporates the previous ones, or in any case can make a new contribution to the previous ones, is precisely anthroposophy. Because with it, one can, for example, read the Gospel of John according to an astrological key, which is an astrological spiritual science. One can do so according to alchemy, the alchemical spiritual science. One can do so through magic, a magical spiritual science. However, these forms came earlier. They evolved first and were able to intercept, so to speak, the evolution of the soul from the rational affective soul to the consciousness soul up to the point when they originated. The last one to originate from the impulse of 1879 and 1899, that is the evolution of Michael to Arche, spirit of time, and the end of the Kali Yuga, is precisely anthroposophy. It therefore also contains within itself the previous spiritual sciences in a certain sense, or in any case it can give them an impulse of renewal in the consciousness soul. So anthroposophy is a tool, a method that follows spiritual principles, allowing us to read the Gospel of John with a new spiritual depth. Other spiritual sciences, such as astrology, alchemy, magic, etc., have also allowed us to read it in depth, but they stopped at the point where they originated in the evolution of the human soul. Anthroposophy, therefore, allows us to reach that stage of evolution which has not yet been accomplished, but which can be accomplished precisely through anthroposophy. This prepares humanity for the sixth cultural epoch in which the spiritual self will develop. That is why we esoterically call anthroposophy the science of the Holy Spirit, which also means the science of the spiritual self, precisely because the Holy Spirit in man is the spiritual self or manas. In other words, we can say that the spiritual self is the microcosmic Holy Spirit, and what we call Holy Spirit is the macrocosmic spirit. They have a relationship of identity in this, except that one is macro and the other is microcosmic. Without the Christ, humanity would have sunk into matter and would have been, as we have seen, thrown off its evolutionary trajectory, degenerating towards the abyss. If Christ had appeared too soon, and we're obviously talking about after the Luciferic temptation, because originally the Christ was supposed to come in the middle of the Atlantean era, which is exactly halfway through the entire cosmic evolution of the Earth. But after the expulsion from paradise, with the intervention of the Luciferic spirits, the Christ, so to speak, postponed his entry into the epoch after the flood. Being this the situation after the expulsion from paradise, if he had appeared too early, for example in the Paleo-Indian culture, men would not have come to know matter or created physical civilization. Nothing that surrounds us, the innovations that surround technical, scientific and industrial civilization, would have been made. We would not have, for example, railways, we would not have trains, we would not have computers, and so on. By appearing at the right moment, the Christ made possible both the creation of modern external civilization and at the same time opened the way of spiritual ascent beyond matter. So, why does he not come in the fourth Atlantean era but only comes after the flood in the fifth post-Atlantean era? Because otherwise, if he had incarnated between Atlantis and the Indian epoch, which is the epoch that still looks back to Atlantis, the whole material civilization could not have developed and humanity would not really have won over the consequences of the expulsion from earthly paradise, which now, thanks to Christ, it can overcome and thus acquire a new, higher stage of evolution. So the spiritual self that man will evolve in this way, with the help of Christ, is a totally new spiritual self for the cosmos, because it also derives from overcoming the expulsion from paradise. We are obviously humanizing it in a certain sense, but we can say this: since humanity has succumbed to the Luciferic temptation, it can develop further forces that the divine plan of evolution did not initially foresee. It succumbed to the Luciferic temptation, it succumbed to the Ahrimanic temptation in the Atlantean era, and at that point it can develop totally new forces. So not only will the human being become the 10th hierarchy, the spirit of love, but also freedom. Freedom combined with love. Why does it also become the spirit of freedom combined with love? Love is acquired with Christ, but freedom was given to us by Lucifer, even if he gave it to us in an immature form. The Christ comes to complete this evolution. He therefore frees us from Luciferic spirits, thus allowing us to combine freedom and love. Before the mystery of Golgotha, these were called knowledge and life. Knowledge therefore becomes freedom. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And what was the original life of paradise becomes the love of Christ. With this deed, that is, Christ allowing the creation of modern external civilization with the descent to the deepest depth of matter, at the same time opening the way for spiritual ascent beyond matter, the Christ acted as the balancer at the turning point of time. He acted as an impulse of balance between matter and spirit. This would not have happened if Christ had come in the Atlantean era after the expulsion from earthly paradise, because man would have refused to come into contact with matter. What would have happened then? The spirits of obstacle would have had a much greater hold over human beings, particularly the Ahrimanic spirits that await us in matter. Luciferic spirits await us in our inner being, in our soul, and the Ahrimanic ones in the reality we experience in our everyday lives. We can say that the Gospel of John could not be fully understood until now because it was too spiritual for a materialistic civilization. Entering in the consciousness soul, and as the forces of the consciousness soul evolve and anthroposophy appears, it becomes understandable to our thinking in its esoteric initiatory essence. The process of understanding the Gospel of John is complete. It will be this Gospel that will guide the transition from the fifth to the sixth epoch of culture, from the selfishness and materialism that prevail today to the community of spirit. Just as the Christ allowed the spirit to be resurrected in matter, Christian initiation allows us to grasp a dual meaning of any event at the same time. In this lecture, we will talk about the 7 stages of Christian Gnostic initiation. Those who achieve the initiation called Christian Gnostic or Christian Esoteric, Rosicrucian or Yogic, we will talk about these 3 parts, begin to experience every event on 2 planes. On the physical material plane, that is what happens in the sensory world, what we usually call reality, external reality, and on a spiritual plane, which is the reflection of the event as an image of great cosmic processes emanating simultaneously from the past and the future. This also applies to the evangelist John, in that the events narrated, such as the wedding at Cana, to which we will return, are read by him with the consciousness of an initiate, and it comprises both an external physical plane and a spiritual and inner plane. The initiation, the process of initiation, follows the rhythm of 3.5 days. These are the 3 cosmic days of creation before Christ, and at the same time after Christ. Therefore, Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth Mars, which is the first half, and then Earth, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan. They are 3.5, and 3.5 plus 3.5 makes 7. These are the 7 cosmic metamorphoses. In ancient times, the candidate to initiation was placed in a state of initiatory sleep for 3.5 days, during which he experienced progressive ascension into the spiritual worlds, the higher worlds. On the 3rd day, the culminating vision was the prophecy of the future of humanity, and in particular, the celebration of the mystical marriage. These 3.5 days are also images of the periods of civilization, those we talked about, the first day or stage, which goes from the 3rd to the 4th epoch as the revelation of God of the I Am, until the descent of the Messiah. The 2nd day, which goes from the 4th to the 5th epoch as the descent of Christ into matter, and the 3rd day, which goes from the 5th to the 6th epoch as the mystical marriage of humanity with the spiritual self. In this sense, the first sign that John points to, which is the wedding at Cana, is therefore a cosmic prophecy. The Gospel says that on the third day there was a wedding at Cana. On the third day means at the culmination of the initiation there was a wedding at Cana. The initiate, therefore, understands that this is not just an earthly external marriage, but the great prophecy, the wedding of humanity with the spiritual self in the sixth epoch. The mystical marriage, the complete maturation of Christianity in the communities of spirit, which we have also called Grail communities or communities of Aquarius. Aquarius is the one who pours water. What happens at the wedding at Cana? The water that has been poured into the cups is changed into wine and becomes a sign of this process, that is, the transition from blood-related love, the love of blood, brotherhood, to the spiritual love of spiritual brotherhood, which is universal and given by Christ. And the Christ replies to his mother, saying that his time has not yet come. This means that the time of the I Am, this mystical wedding of humanity, cannot yet take place. That is a prophecy. Humanity is not yet mature, but it will come. My time, therefore, has not yet come, but it will come. When? In the sixth cultural epoch, when humanity will experience this mystical wedding, which the initiates of the Church of Joan, including, as we said, the Templars, experienced in advance. All those who internalize the Church of Joan experience it. At the time of the events of the 3 years, such as the wedding at Cana, love based on blood descent and brotherhood of spirit was still at work. Only in future times, thanks to the Christ, will universal spiritual love arise. And here we can dwell further into the episode of the wedding at Cana in order to understand its even more occult, deeper aspects. Bearing in mind that the images of the Gospels always have a double reality, so to speak, a historical one as external events, and an esoteric one as initiatory experiences of universal spiritual processes, we must read the wedding at Cana in this sense, which is, I remind you, the first sign. We will then talk briefly about the other signs, of which there are 7 in the Gospel of John. At the wedding at Cana, Jesus Christ performs the first miraculous sign of the presence of the I Am who has incarnated. He transforms water into wine in the presence of his mother as the first sign of his divine ministry. In order to understand how the wedding at Cana relates to the mystical wedding of the sixth cultural epoch, we must remember that the incarnation of Christ on earth is not a sudden process, but a gradual one, which is only completed with the mystery of Golgotha. Between the wedding at Cana and the mystery of Golgotha, there is a gradual incarnation, so to speak, with a progressive increase in the Christ's power to grasp the sheets of Jesus of Nazareth. So, as soon as he incarnates at the age of 30, immediately afterwards he experiences the temptations which demonstrate how much the Christ knows human nature. Gradually, after the temptations, there is the wedding at Cana in the Gospel of John, and gradually the episodes that follow show that Christ progressively incarnates and acquires more and more ability to interpenetrate human nature. The Gospel of John describes this process of progressive incarnation of Christ and therefore the transformation of the sheets of Jesus of Nazareth through the sequence of the 7 miraculous signs. The first is the wedding at Cana, which is John 2, verses 1 to 12. Where Jesus transforms water into wine, thus foreshadowing what will be the final evolution of Christianity itself, namely the sixth cultural epoch, and also union of masculine and feminine forces in the sense of spirit and soul, or if you like, solar and lunar. The second sign is the healing of the royal official's son, John 4, verses 43 to 54, which takes place in Capernaum, where he demonstrates his authority over the spirits that cause illness, the spirits of obstacle. The third sign is the healing of the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, John 5, verses 1 to 9, which takes place on the Sabbath, where he therefore reveals his action, his ministry, even in contrast to the law of the dominant Jewish tradition, by which the Sabbath was a day of rest. Then the fourth sign is the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, John 6, verses 1 to 15, which is done to feed a large crowd, but this is only the outer appearance. The inner image is that of the new spiritual life that he will give to humanity. The fifth sign is the walking on water, John 6, verses 16 to 21, on the Sea of Tiberias, thus showing his dominion over the elements and his ability to dominate the astral forces in the same way. The sixth sign is the healing of the man born blind, John 9, verses 1 to 41, who heals spiritual blindness and thus reveals the new true spiritual light. He is the true light, not Lucifer, the bringer of light, who pretends to be the light, but the light that gives this new spiritual vision, the light of Christ. And the seventh is the unforgivable sign, obviously from the point of view of his adversaries, which is the resurrection of Lazarus, who is John himself, and it is found in John 11, verses 17 and 44. This is the greatest sign and, as I was saying, unforgivable, especially for the Sanhedrin, because it demonstratively shows his power over death and thus opens the way to a new faith that is no longer based on the ancient mysteries that were now in decline, but on the new mysteries of which the I Am itself is the minister. These are the 7 signs. However, we will focus, as Steiner does it in the series of lectures, on the wedding at Cana, also because it introduces the topic of the next lecture, the 12th. So the first of the miraculous signs is precisely the transformation of water into wine at the wedding at Cana. Here the Christ has just descended into incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth and is therefore still dependent on the forces that unite him with his mother. We have seen how Rudolf Steiner translates the corresponding passage in John 2, verse 4. Woman, this passes between you and me, to refer to the forces that are transmitted between Jesus and his mother. Furthermore, Christ also needs the elemental forces of the spring water that is mentioned as just drawn. What does this mean? It means that the Christ must still make use of the old forces that dominated in pre-Christian times, namely those of the mother and of water. But as soon as the miracle at Cana is performed, the overcoming of these ancient forces begins at the same time. So the wedding at Cana is, we might say, a significant image both of the end of the forces of the past, which will continue to act on humanity for a long time to come, and of the necessary overcoming of these old natural forces which pass through blood and the elements. Blood, the mother, and the elements. It is no coincidence that the wedding takes place outside Judea in Galilee. Galilee is the land of the mixing of lineages, of those who are not bound by the same blood. So this miracle of the spiritual union of the I with the soul, and thus the actual transformation of the astral body into spiritual self, as was explained earlier, can only take place when one is not bound by the same blood. When the concept of blood brotherhood is overcome. The ancient abilities of clairvoyance were linked to the blood bond, which was maintained by the priestly caste. And you remember we said that they practiced this form of eugenics, of selecting crossbreeding within a people by means of marriage within the same people. This because the purity of the blood allowed the members of the people to remain united to the group's soul. The incarnations, therefore, before Christ, before the eye, took place in the same bloodline. They were kept linked to the same soul of the people, the group soul. And by reincarnating within the same people, they inherited the same clairvoyant abilities. So the mixing of two different bloodlines meant the loss of the ancient clairvoyance, which had already been lost, but it meant losing it further. The Christ, on the other hand, comes precisely among those who are mixed. And he says that these first signs can only occur among those who are not of pure blood, because all that was the purity of blood had to be overcome in order to give individuality, the I am, the possibility, the inner space to develop. This would not have been possible if the ancient clairvoyance had remained. To this end, therefore, marriage between blood relatives had to be overcome by marriage between members of different peoples, by the mixing of blood, thus opening up a new source of morality that is characteristic of our fifth cultural epoch. This characterizes the mission of the entire post-Atlantean era, but it will manifest itself in particular in our epoch of the consciousness soul. Or, at least, it can. If we succeed in transcending blood brotherhood. We know well today how much these forces still work where, let's say, it is wished that blood brotherhood prevail. So, the even deeper esoteric spiritual meaning of the wedding at Cana is that, we might say, humanity had to be excluded for a certain time from the immediate vision of the spiritual world. And how does this happen? Through the consumption of wine. In particular, the use of wine in the cult of Dionysus, which is also mentioned in the Bible in Genesis with Noah after the flood. This cult of wine and intoxication increased progressively in the fourth cultural epoch, particularly among the Greek and Roman peoples. Why is this? Because with the consuming of wine, the atavistic clairvoyant vision, which referred back to antiquity, would be lost. And so it is said in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 29, "Blessed are those who do not see and believe. Blessed are those who have lost their clairvoyance and now have a new form of knowledge." So wine within the human being obscured the knowledge of the spiritual world, and in particular of reincarnation and karma, which allowed, or rather the human being was allowed, to develop its own personality on earth undisturbed. Since this task has already been largely accomplished today, we now have a well-developed personality, and therefore we now need to make a personality transparent to be able to remember previous incarnations and thus face karma. Wine has lost its spiritual significance, but it was necessary for humanity to go through at least one incarnation in which it had absolutely no awareness of previous earthly lives. In this way, the principle of being individuals, and thus the foundation for freedom, could develop. Steiner also says elsewhere that another effect of wine was to prepare the physical body for the body of resurrection, that is, the body of Christ risen from the tomb. So this is another aspect obviously occurring before the resurrection. In fact, Steiner says that in the sacrament of the Christian Eucharist, water and wine are mixed together in the chalice at the altar. Then the chalice, which can be seen at the moment when water and wine are mixed during Mass, during the Eucharist, becomes an image of the human being, whose physical body is made up of what we might call the visible part, the chalice itself, and the water that is placed in it, and of wine, the spirit, that is, the spiritual life of the eye. In this way, the earthly and cosmic elements are combined. In this way, just as on the altar of the Mass, the physical body is prepared in such a way as to develop a certain attraction to the body of resurrection. Obviously, something that then ends with the resurrection itself, with the process that goes from the wedding at Cana to the mystery of Golgotha to the resurrection. At this point, what is that after the wine allows us to enter into resonance with the body of the resurrection? Because the wine only prepared this way as long as it was necessary. It is the initiation, the new spirit that Christ gives. It is that initiation that Lazarus experiences when he rises again as Joan. So in particular, this attraction to the body of resurrection, to the risen Christ, or if you prefer, the etheric Christ, is reinforced by the initiation of the Church of Joan and that of the Rosicrucians, that is, what we call the Christian Gnostic or Christian Esoteric and Rosicrucianism. And here we're obviously concerned with the Christian Gnostic or Christian Esoteric one. Steiner will tell us that this is not an allegory or symbolism alone, at least. Initiation is a real experience for the disciple of esotericism, and Joan tells us what an initiate actually experiences both in the outer world and at the same time in the spiritual world. In particular, the one who lives the life of Christ most intensely and consciously, and who is the first to develop a fully conscious I together with the spiritual self, is Joan, who thus inaugurates a path of initiation that we can undertake, the Christian esoteric or Christian Gnostic path, that is, the Church of Joan, in order to understand more and more the impulse of the Christ. The impulse of Christ is so vast that humanity has only been able to understand a small part of it. Full understanding will only be possible in the future, and the wedding at Cana is an initiatory prophecy of when in that future, in the sixth cultural epoch, the impulse of Christ will be understood much more fully. By transforming water into wine, the Christ prophetically reveals the conditioned blood love, that is, blood brotherhood, will be transformed into universal spiritual love. But he also announces that this time has not yet come and will only be fulfilled with the future evolution of humanity in the sixth cultural epoch, the Aquarian or Russo-Slavic epoch, with the maturing of spiritual love and the occurrence of the mystical wedding, as we were saying, of the I with the purified soul, of humanity with the spiritual self. Furthermore, Steiner says that the relationship between the physical body and the astral body, yet another esoteric reading of the wedding at Cana, is like that between mother and child. This initiatory process is described in the Gospel of John. In the 2nd chapter, verse 1, it is said, "On the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there." Steiner says, when a certain degree of initiation has been achieved, one can leave the physical body. This is what is called astral travel, in a way that is more, shall we say, usual for us today. It is the projection of the astral body outside the physical body. So what happens? At the moment of astral travel, the astral body is projected outside the physical body, and the physical body finds itself before the astral body, which is the body in which we can have a certain consciousness. And Steiner says that it is just like a child, if it could be conscious of it, finding itself before the mother who gave birth to it. For this reason, the relationship between mother and child also includes the relationship between the physical body and the external projection of the completely spiritualized astral body. Just as a newborn child in front of its mother, if it could see itself as it was before inside the mother and as it was outside the mother. The process of initiation that makes the human being clairvoyant and capable of projecting the astral body requires this experience of 3.5 days, reaching the same consciousness on the astral plane that one had before only on the physical plane. In occult language, this union of the human soul with the spiritual worlds is another aspect of the mystical marriage. The mystical marriage also implies that one can project the astral body outside the physical body, freeing the astral body from the constraints of the physical body while retaining the consciousness of the I. So one of the properties that one has at the moment of the mystical marriage is also the ability to project the astral body outside the physical body, just like a mother gives birth to a child. And in fact, says Steiner in John 8, verses 58-59, we can find a certain expression, and I will read it to you. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." That is, the Christ in me. Then they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, passing through them through the obstacles. Even in these verses, says Steiner, the process of the astral body leaving the physical body is described. And when the mystical wedding has been celebrated, as in the wedding at Cana, the physical body stands before the initiate, who conscious in the astral body as the I am, can address his physical body, saying, "This is my mother, she gave birth to me." And for this reason, says Steiner, Christ on the cross said these words in John 19, verses 26 and 27, which I quote here. Jesus then, seeing his mother, that is, as we have said, Mary Sophia, and taking from her the disciple whom he loved, that is, John, said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son," which means, "Behold your eye in clear thought." And then he said to the disciple John, "Behold your mother," which means, "Behold that from which you were projected out." And from that moment, the disciple took her into his home. This home of his is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So it means that at that moment, John is given the total process of Christian esoteric or Christian Gnostic initiation. So, woman, here is your son, and here is your mother. At that point, John is fully in his astral body, his I, which can observe events simultaneously on a physical and spiritual plane. So when humans today, yearning for the Christ according to the Gospel of John, relive his archetypal gestures within their own biography, they do so like a child imitating its parents, in a sense, because they recognize themselves as the son of a father and mother in a cosmic sense. The father and mother in a cosmic sense. We said this last time. And so, when the I, which we can call the Christ I, the higher solar I, is born in the human soul, and we evolve the spiritual self in the transition between the fifth and sixth epochs, then we too will experience what we described in the last meeting, the Immaculate Conception. Because we ourselves, what we truly are, much more than in the incarnated earthly self, will be conceived in an immaculate way. That is, our higher self, our Christic I, or if you like, the Christ I, will be born within our soul, which will have been purified of Luciferic spirits. This process, which will take place in the fifth, sixth, and seventh cultural epochs, will ensure that all the elect of Christ, the elect of the Apocalypse, will then be born in the sense that Steiner describes, through Immaculate Conception. How is this expressed? We find it also in Paul's saying, "Not I, but Christ in me," meaning not my lower earthly I, but my higher solar I within me, which is conceived immaculately within a soul purified from the craving of Luciferic spirits. Here I refer back to what I said last time. It will happen just as when the Great Mother, the Sophia, conceived Christ immaculately. At that point, the planet Earth as a whole will also experience this in the events of the Apocalypse. So there will be not only a man, not I, but Christ in me, in the microcosmic, there will also be a not I, but Christ in me of the earth. We said, you remember, that the Great Mother was the goddess of Lemuria, the deity of the matriarchs of Lemuria, and she had the solo child in her womb. This Great Mother gives birth to her son in the earth, which is the mystery of Golgotha. But these two beings, Christ and Sophia, are in reality, in a certain sense, two halves of the same being. The Virgin Sophia has always been part of Christ. They separated with the descent of Christ to earth and with the mystery of Golgotha. And when did they begin the process of becoming one again? Precisely at the wedding at Cana. And they will complete this reunion in the Apocalypse at the moment of the opening of the fifth seal of the Apocalypse. What you see here, the woman clothed with the son of the Apocalypse. Thus, what happens in man, this microcosmic mystical wedding, will also happen in a macrocosmic sense for Earth. These concepts that we have called the mysteries of the Father and Mother in the Gospel of John are not symbols, allegories, they are spiritual realities. Therefore, understanding the cosmic father and mother, which is precisely what Christ Jesus refers to when he speaks of father and mother, is equivalent to understanding the essence of the Church of Joan, esoteric Gnostic Christianity. And this requires seeing how initiation transforms the human being's relationship with their neighbor, Earth, and the cosmos. The initiate, we have said, is one who, while living in the physical body, in the physical world, has direct experience of the spiritual worlds, both in relation to his neighbor and to the earth and the cosmos, gradually expanding his sphere of consciousness. The initiate does not shy away from earthly feelings, family, nation, people, but transfigures them through the Christ. So these feelings of family, nation, people, blood are transfigured into universal feelings that can be then accepted by the spiritual world. Just as the father and mother are no longer the father and mother of blood, but are cosmic father and mother, so too are all the other feelings that are linked to what we feel, for instance, for the family, the nation, the people, no longer linked to blood, but spiritualized, Christified. So there will be a spiritual family, a spiritual nation, a spiritual people, so much so that what does Christ speak of? The kingdom of heaven. For this reason, Steiner says the initiate is also called a man without a homeland, not because they renounce their belonging to earth, they must live there, they must conquer indeed the earthly experience, but because in the spiritual world they know and are aware that they cannot bring particular sympathies that are drawn from blood ties. Because in the spiritual world, only objectivity prevails. Even in early human evolution, man already lived in a homeless state and was connected to original clairvoyance. In the Lemurian era, there was no patriotism or division. These began to emerge gradually, especially from the second half of the Atlantean era, and then much more clearly with the birth of the various human ethnic groups after the flood. With the progressive descent into earthly conditions, man differentiated into races, peoples, and communities, into groups and ethnicities. Love initially was limited to the blood group that was related to the family, to the homeland. In particular, this was the case after the flood of Atlantis, when blood ties prevailed in the brotherhood of blood brought by Jehovah, the spirit of the moon. The lunar forces bring blood ties. The evolution of Christ, the solar spirit, aims to make love universal, as we have already said, to widen the circle of love to universal brotherhood connected to the spiritual self. So what is Christianity? It is the way to make love universal. What for the initiate had always been an individual experience becomes with Christ an impulse for all humanity. Therefore, the initiate wanted to overcome consanguinity and cultivate universal love. Now, as we welcome Christ, we will reach the sixth epoch in which this impulse will extend to all humanity. Since Christ is the spirit of the earth, the planet Earth itself, which is his body, will experience this universal love. We know that humanity and the earth are one. So these are two processes that we can see from a more human or a more earthly point of view, but they mirror each other. And man is the agent of this. Man is the protagonist of this change. It is the man who has welcomed the Christ. The garment of the earth, and Steiner will return to it, has been progressively divided into lands and possessions, material goods, since the middle of the Atlantean era, but even more so after the flood, generating separation, selfishness, appropriation. But the earth was originally one with man, and no one possessed anything in relation to another. Even today, says Steiner, one part is indivisible, and that is the atmosphere, the air that surrounds everyone and from which man received the breath of life, the first seed of the eye. So on the one hand, we have the earth, the surface of the earth, which is divided, and on the other, the earth's atmosphere, which is united. For this reason, and Paul will also say this, but it is also said in the descriptions of Christ's ascension, where does Christ ascend? From the earth to the heavens, from the earth to the atmosphere, from the state of division where he descended and incarnated in the physical body, to the state of unity that humanity can still experience, which is the atmosphere. In fact, Paul says that Christ rose among the clouds. Therefore, man, through Christ, is called to rediscover the strength of the eye, which is also the strength of unity. Just like air, the atmosphere that cannot be possessed or divided by anyone. These are issues of today. The Christ is rejected even where it is said that he's welcomed, and then he's not welcomed. Division is experienced. But imagine also where the Christ is not welcomed at all. So the initiate anticipates this task by wanting to become the prototype of what all humanity will gradually experience. In this respect, in the Gospel of John, it is said that Christ's garments are divided, but Christ's tunic remains undivided. In John 19, verses 23-24, it is said, "And they divided his garments among them, but the tunic they did not divide." Divided garments are what we have said, the territories, the continents, what can be appropriated in an external sense on earth, leading to division, fragmentation, appropriation. But the undivided tunic is the air, it is the atmosphere, which is indivisible. It is the outward image of universal love that embraces the whole earth. So the tunic represents what is destined to remain common to all humans and which will form the basis of the future brotherhood of spirit in the sixth epoch. And in fact, initially, the Christ comes in a physical body that is divided from others in the sheets of Jesus. Nevertheless, the risen Christ, the etheric Christ, returns in his second coming in the earth's atmosphere, which is indeed undivided in unity. In order to reach this state of unity, Steiner says that there are three main parts of initiation: the ancient yogic initiation, ancient initiatory yoga, which represents the path of the Eastern mysteries and the entire Atlantean evolution that wants to return to before the flood and is centered on the control of the breath that influences thoughts. The second path is the Gnostic or esoteric Christian initiation, centered on reliving the events leading up to the mystery of Golgotha, the imitatio Christi, and its consequences, and is a path that mediates between the Eastern and Western mysteries. It is centered on the feeling that mediates between thinking and willing. The third path, which is the Rosicrucian initiation, is the most suitable for modern humans because it allows one not to renounce external life, being the path of Western mysteries and of the Western world. It is centered on the will that animates and activates the thinking. This path of initiation places the human being in the process by which the organs of spiritual perception are formed, awakened and opened. In the physical world, we perceive because the body has developed organs evolved from ancient undifferentiated organs and that have evolved from the very forces they perceive. So light has allowed the evolution of the eye, sound of the ear, and so on. In the same way, spiritual organs are needed for the spiritual world, organs in the subtle bodies, in the etheric body, and in the astral body. This is very logical. If you think about it and concentrate on it, you will understand that if the organs of the physical body exist, those of the etheric body and the astral body also exist, but they have a lower degree of evolution than the physical body. Currently, these organs are not fully developed and must be shaped by forces that correspond to them, such as light for the eye, sound for the ear, and so on. What are these forces called? They are the forces of spiritual exercises and meditation that culminate in the experience of initiation. In particular, this occurs through work on the astral body during sleep. While awake, the astral body is bound to the physical body and is therefore not free. It is limited by it. However, during sleep it is freed, although it gradually loses consciousness, the ability to maintain a state of consciousness. Initiation occurs by acting on the bodies while awake. Through spiritual exercises or the fundamental exercises, the impressions gained from these exercises and meditation remain imprinted in the astral body even when it separates from the physical body during sleep. So, the fundamental exercises, which are spiritual exercises, and meditation ensure that the astral body maintains its state of consciousness so that it can develop higher organs of perception once it has left the physical body. Here, Steiner criticizes those who claim that this is not possible, denouncing, let's say, those who deny the spiritual worlds simply because they do not perceive them. He says it is as if someone who is blind to colors were to say that colors do not exist. Therefore, what is brought by anthroposophical spiritual science or esotericism in general is not an invention, but it does require adequate organs of perception. On the other hand, religion, external Christianity, which rejects Christian esotericism, falls into the same error as positivist science. It claims that what does not fit into its own understanding of the gospel, in this case, does not exist, but it is the gospel of journey itself, which is the gospel, we might say, of modern initiation, which with its expressions shows up precisely that Christian esotericism exists. Let us take up again the example of the undivided tunic, which is a key that, understood in an initiatory sense, shows how in the mystery of Golgotha a cosmic teaching is given, understandable only with developed supersensible organs of the etheric and astral bodies. and universal love, which is precisely the etheric tunic, we might say, of the Christ, the air in the undivided atmosphere, and spiritual brotherhood, are therefore not allegories but spiritual realities that await to be perceived by developing the organs that can perceive them. And we now come to the path of esoteric Gnostic Christian initiation. Although we can say that Rosicrucian initiation is the modern way to form those organs and thus also understand the Gospels in general and the Gospel of John today, the Gospel of John shows us the Christian Gnostic way of initiation practiced in the Church of John and in the movements that evolved from it, such as the Manichaeans, the Cathars, and, as we have said, the Templars, as well as by the saints, through the imitation of Christ, imitatio Christi, especially in the first 13 centuries of Christianity. However, in reality, these two paths are not separated. In fact, we know that Rosicrucian initiation arose as an evolution of the path of Gnostic Christian or esoteric Christian initiation when the natural sciences were added to it in the 13th century, thanks to an event that we know about. If you wish to learn more, it's in the commentary on esoteric Christianity and Rosicrucian Christianity, which are two seminars I have given in recent years, when the initiation of the unknown child took place in the 13th century among the Cathars. This unknown child is none other than a fundamental intermediate incarnation of John himself, who would later become Christian Rosenkreuz. So the Christian Gnostic path of initiation also evolved, together with the Rosicrucian one, after the 13th century by comprising the natural sciences within itself, in addition to the sole imitation of Christ in the events of the 3 years of the Gospel. So Christian Gnostic or esoteric initiation, I repeat, works on the feeling because it originates from the third cultural epoch of the sentient soul. You can see it here. Remember, we said Gnosis was born in the third cultural epoch with the Egyptians, and from those mysteries the way of John evolved. In fact, if you remember, Lazarus is initiated by the Christ into John when he experiences the same initiation that the Egyptians practiced in the sarcophagus. So, this Christian Gnostic initiation is an evolution of the Gnostic initiation of the sentient soul, original to the third epoch, adapted to the fourth. It is a method particularly suited to ancient times and monastic life, where one could devote oneself completely to contemplative life. It is less suited to modern life and today's society, which is why the Rosicrucian path of initiation arose in the 13th century, combining the contemplative life with the active life. The path of Christian Gnostic initiation works exclusively on feeling and not on thought through breathing, as in the yogic path, and not on the will, as in the Rosicrucian path. The astral body is transformed thanks to these experiences of inner life, which during sleep form the spiritual organs, as I mentioned earlier. The 7 degrees of the Gnostic Christian initiation within the sphere of the feeling are a recapitulation of the stages of the Passion. I will list them and describe them briefly. First, the washing of the feet, which corresponds to the sphere of the moon, in which every higher being recognizes its depth to the lower. Feeling becomes cosmic, The plant bows to the stone, the animal to the plant, and man to the kingdoms of nature. Just as the Christ, who is the master of masters, to his disciples. Today, there are many who proclaim themselves masters and then have their disciples wash their feet, so to speak, in quotation marks. It is the Christ who washes the feet of his disciples. The symptoms, there are external symptoms, are the sensation of feet immersed in water and the astral vision of the washing of feet. The second stage is called flagellation, corresponding to the sphere of Mercury, and is the ability to withstand all pain and adversity without bending. The symptoms are the perception of blows coming from all directions, just like flagellation, and the astral vision of the event of flagellation. The third stage is the crowning with thorns in the sphere of Venus, where what is sacred is mocked and humiliated, and therefore one must remain steadfast in devotion to what is sacred, and in particular, not commit the unforgivable sin. One must remain steadfast in the I am. Those who deny the I am commit the only true sin that cannot be forgiven, namely the denial of the I am, or sin against the Holy Spirit, as it was called. The symptoms are painful pricks to a halo around the head, a circle around the head, which then also open the organs of perception, as you can understand, and correspond to the astral vision of the crowning. You must therefore imagine that with the washing of the feet, human consciousness is expanded to the lower realms. With the flagellation and crowning with thorns, tears are literally opened in the subtle bodies of man. Such tears that Christ experienced in the physical body and weakened his physical body by tearing the physical body increased the Christ's ability to remain in incarnation. Because if this had not happened, the Christ would have destroyed the physical body of Jesus of Nazareth. Instead, by being scourged and crowned with thorns, we can say that the spiritual light of Christ can shine through the physical body of Jesus. Therefore, the experience of the scourging and the crowning with thorns opens further spiritual organs of perception, one in the body and the other in the head. In the body, the flagellation; in the head, the crowning with thorns. Then we come to the fourth stage, which is the crucifixion in the sphere of the sun, and is also called the trial of blood, because blood must be shed, in quotation marks. That is, one sacrifices one's own blood, the vehicle of one's own eye. There is a radical detachment from the body, from everything that has been formed by blood. The physical body and what derives from blood ties is perceived as a foreign object, a garment that can be taken off. This is what I was saying before, the possibility of leaving the physical body with the astral body while maintaining the consciousness of the I. The symptoms that can be both visible and invisible are the stigmata on the hands and feet and on the side, and the astral vision of the crucifixion. The fifth stage, called mystical death in the sphere of Mars, where everything disappears as if behind a black veil, is the descent into the underworld. In the abyss of evil and pain, one experiences hell until this veil of darkness is torn and the vision of the spiritual world opens up. In the sixth stage, called burial and resurrection in the sphere of Jupiter, the disciple feels united with the body of the whole earth, as if lying in it. This is the burial. Then, in the aspect of resurrection, they are the same degree divided in two, there is an expansion of the I until complete identification with the whole planet Earth. The sphere of consciousness becomes one with the planet Earth, just as Christ became the spirit of the earth. The seventh degree is the ascension into the sphere of Saturn. It is an experience that Steiner defines ineffable, beyond what can be expressed in earthly language. It is a full union with the spiritual world and marks the completion of Gnostic Christian or esoteric Christian initiation. We conclude with saying that the Eastern path of initiation and the Western Rosicrucian path also have 7 ascending degrees corresponding to this path. Perhaps we will talk about this again for comparison. Each station of the Passion is therefore not to be contemplated only as an external event, as I said before, that is something that happened historically to Jesus Christ, but it is also an inner step of the soul on its own initiation. And the evangelist John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was precisely the guardian of this initiatory knowledge. The Passion, as described in the Gospel of John, thus becomes an esoteric manual, complemented and completed by the other 3 Gospels. 7 ascending degrees of inner metamorphosis that lead to union with the Christ and the overcoming of the bond with the sensory world alone. Well, with that, we conclude this 11th meeting, and we will see you for the next one, the last one, in a week's time. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Giorgio. Thank you.